Where are you? Is Jesus? Good. Are you sure you'll be able to get into that? Okay.
Nobody here.
There seems to be a corridor full of people out there. I just wonder if. Thanks, Nick. Okay, well, among many other things, Anwar and I have had a good 10-year legacy of sharing lines from 1970s Monty Python episodes of film. So I'm going to begin here by saying, and now for something not so completely different as we head into the next session. I'm actually going to begin, I think, by just introducing to the audience and those on the live stream the panelists who will be appearing in person and presenting, beginning with Isabella Weber. Isabella is, of course, now an associate professor at the University of Massachusetts in Amherst, and most of you will have noticed that Isabella, unfortunately, has not been able to join us today for health reasons. She was able at least to anticipate this as a possibility, and so we're very grateful to welcome Jesus Lara Jauregui, a current graduate student at the University of Massachusetts, who is working with Isabella, and I understand Anwar as well, who will make some comments in Isabella's absence. Otherwise, we do, of course, have with us Ali Khan, who is the Abram Hutzler Professor of Political Economy at Johns Hopkins University. But who am I kidding? He's one of ours. Certainly that's how we've come to regard him for, goodness, it's been 20 years now, and very glad to say that it has been. Ali's research focuses on how economics interfaces with both the human and mathematical sciences, and he's published widely on the history of economic thought, mathematical economics, ethics and epistemology, and the language of economics. And then finally, we're joined by Vivek Chiba, who is currently Professor of Sociology at New York University. Vivek is the editor of Capitalist, a journal of theory and strategy, which he launched with Robert Brenner in 2017. And he is the author of numerous books, including, and I'm mentioning here only the most recent in 2022, The Class Matrix and Confronting Capitalism. And before I invite any of our speakers to take the stage, I want to first begin with another of our written testimonies. This one from Amartya Sen. Amartya Sen is, of course, the Thomas W. Lamont University Professor of Economics and Philosophy at Harvard University. He is also, of course, the 1998 Nobel Laureate in Economics, and also the recipient in 1999 of the Bharat Ratna, India's highest civilian honor, for his contribution to welfare economics. His, of course, many and various contributions to economics are, well, as this biography correctly suggests, too numerous to list here. But among other things, he is the author of Development as Freedom, sorry. We were talking about Freudian slips only yesterday. We've gone from sisters-in-law to mothers-in-law, and now freedom to freedmen. I'm gonna live that down now.
Hey, that's an insult to mothers-in-law.
I'm sorry. But fortunately not my slip. I can blame Ali for that one. Amartya, of course, is the author of Development as Freedom, the argumentative Indian writings on Indian history, culture and identity, and the idea of justice, alongside, of course, many other books and articles. And Amartya's contributions as follows. I'm extremely sorry to have to miss the event on the occasion of my friend Anwar Sheikh's retirement. Anwar is an extraordinarily productive economist, from whose work we have all benefited greatly. I personally have been privileged to be a major beneficiary of the insights that Anwar has provided for economists and social thinkers. Among other things, his path-breaking work on capital has opened many doors in this exceptionally important subject, going back all the way to major insights coming from Marx and many other creative thinkers. Aside from the analytical contributions of Anwar, along with his powerful and game-changing work on pure economic theory, Anwar has also been able to refashion our understanding of economics in an altogether novel way. I must emphasize, however, that along with Anwar's creativity, his kindness and warmth as a human being have also been a matter of major appreciation for me. Anwar has been an incomparable friend, and I expect will remain so over the years to come. I take this opportunity of sending my warmest greetings to Anwar on the exceptional occasion of his retirement. I'm unable to come to the celebratory occasion because of other commitments, but Anwar's presence will be very much in my mind when we all think about how much he has enriched our lives. And so with that, we will turn to our in-person speakers. I think if it's okay, we'll go in the order of the program. So Jesus, I'll invite you to go first. And once again, there will be 15 minutes for remarks, and I'll sort of officiously sit at the front and wave time warnings to all of you. I think that microphone will work, but if not, you can use this.
Hi everyone, thank you very much. My name is Jesus Lara. I am a PhD student of economics at UMass Amherst. I'm going to first read a statement that Professor Isabella sent, and then I'm going to briefly talk about my dissertation research. Dear Anwar, dear everyone, I wish I could be there with you in person today to celebrate Anwar. When I first arrived at the new school, I was a master's student, full of ambition and thirsty to learn, but without that theoretical guiding star. Anwar's lectures and mentorship changed this. His insistence on being logically consistent from the first step on challenged us all to learn thinking economics. He taught us to be in conversation with the classics, with Smith, Ricardo, Marx, to read them in the original and to engage in a conversation with what they are teaching us. And this is empowering. Who could be intimidated by a Lucas, Prescott, or Sargent if they were trained to debate with the classes under Anwar Shaikh's eagle-eyed watch? The ambition to build a theoretically coherent economics from beginning to end is something most of us do not dare to pursue. But Anwar has done just that. Learning from Anwar in the first place is not about criticizing the mainstream, but about getting economics right, and from that standpoint of a really existing theoretical alternative, show where the mainstream is leading us astray. As an engineer, Anwar insists what is true has to be proven in reality. You cannot say, I built a better plane because I have better assumptions. But you can say, I built a better plane if your plane flies higher, faster, more reliably, with less emissions, or whatever you may choose as a criteria. As Anwar's a student, I am trying to teach some of his theories and his ambition to my students. Sending my warmest wishes, and I hope to see you all before too long, Isabel. Okay, so now I'm going to talk about my dissertation research, which is advised by Professor Isabella Weber. This is work in progress, and as such it could benefit a lot from any comments that you may have. Yeah, here I will try to explain the ways in which the theory of real competition on a world scale can help us understand international trade in the era of hyper-globalized capitalism. My immediate motivation for this problem comes from the economic experience of my country, Mexico, which as a consequence of the debt crisis of the 1980s and the abrupt liberalization reform that came with it, experienced an equally abrupt structural change in its economic structure and international trade. On the left panel, we can see Mexico's export profile, dominated by manufactured goods such as transport equipment and electronics, in a pattern very similar to that of advanced capitalist countries. At the same time, as can be seen in the panel in the right, Mexico experienced a drastic expansion in its exports that was not followed by an equally accelerated expansion of GDP, but the opposite in fact, a reduction in the rate of economic growth, as well as an increase in inequality, poverty, informality, among others. And since then, back during the first maquiladora boom, then with the NAFTA boom, and now with the so-called nearshoring, the same explanation is given in the press, in academic publications, by politicians, which is the low value-added nature of Mexican exports. This explanation is usually framed in two ways. Low value-added as a consequence of the nature of the activity, that is sometimes characterized as unskilled, simple, or labor-intensive, or low value-added in the sense that these exports constitute primarily assembly activities of means of production imported from abroad. So because of all of this, I asked the very simple question: what is the domestic value added of exports and what does it depend on? And I will outline the answer that we can get from the theory of real competition, how it differs from alternative answers, and more importantly, the ways for advancing in the empirical research of this problem. Now, the most basic definition of DVA, or the domestic content of exports, is simply gross exports minus import of intermediate goods. This measure is supposed to reflect what share of the exports are actually produced by the domestic economy. And as such, it shows how dependent the firms of a particular country are on the world market for their production activities. And to the extent that the emergence of global value chains imply a growing fragmentation of production across the planet, this measure becomes relevant. Now, I will use the following example to illustrate the determinants of the domestic value added of exports from a purely accounting perspective. So we consider a commodity whose selling price is 100, and this is represented by the area of the box, of the big box. The stages that are necessary for its production and distribution are raw materials extraction, the manufacturing of components, product assembly, and design, marketing, finance, retail, which take place in 4 countries, in countries A, B, C, and D, respectively. The firm located in each country exports the semi-finished commodity to the next firm in the next country at a given price. This price is represented by the area of its box and all the boxes below it. In this way, the area of this small box represents the recorded value added at each stage, which is simply the price of the good minus the imports of intermediate inputs. And this allows us to calculate the domestic content of exports for each of the countries involved in the value chain. So this shows a very basic accounting results, which is that the domestic value added of exports depends on 2 things. First, on the number of stages that the capitals of a country specialize in, that is, how many of these boxes take place in a particular country, and the price of these stages, which is the relative size of these boxes. So and we derive possibility of low value added of exports without yet making any references to profits, to wages, or to the technology of production. So this means that understanding that determinants of the actual export performance of national economies, even after the emergence of global value chains, requires understanding the determinants of 2 things. First, international specialization across the value chain, and international prices. And these 2 questions fall completely within the domain of the theories of international trade. Now, mainstream economic theory has very well-defined answers to these questions, to the question of international specialization and prices, and the answer is that they are determined by the comparative cost of production. The mechanisms that brings this into reality is that the terms of trade are supposed to adjust in order to balance trade, so that in the end, each country ends up specializing in the production of goods which initially had a comparative advantage, a comparative cost advantage, so that in the end, free international trade makes every nation equally competitive. However, if we look at the empirical evidence, both before and after the last wave of capitalist globalization and neoliberalism, a different picture emerges. First, we see the well-known trade imbalance between the US and China. We have the trade balance as a share of GDP on the y-axis. However, this is not something exclusive to these countries. When we look at the trade balance for 4 different income groups, in this case excluding the US and China, we see exactly the same pattern. We can see also that lower income countries, which are the 2 lines at the bottom, suffer from persistent trade deficits, whereas in general, trade surpluses are more prevalent in upper middle and even more in higher income countries. We see exactly the same pattern when we focus on individual countries. We have the GDP per capita on the x-axis and the trade balance as a share of GDP on the y-axis, both for the period from 1980 to 2000 and to the period from 2000 to 2022. There are very few countries that lie close to the horizontal line, to the perfect trade balance. In general, we see persistent trade imbalances being more frequent trade deficits for lower income countries and trade surpluses for higher income countries. And here, the theory of real competition on an international scale becomes very important because it represents a criticism of the theory of comparative advantage. The criticism is based both on the empirical evidence, but also on the logical inconsistency of the argument of the Ricardian theory of trade. And hence it provides very different answers to the question of international specialization and international price determination. So first of all, it is an absolute cost theory of international trade, which means that the same principles that apply within a national economy are expected to apply at the international scale, which means that the individual capitals that produce with the lowest international cost are those more likely to survive to international competition. These will be the international regulating capitals. So to the question of who produces what or what of international specialization, the theory answers that that is determined by real production cost. To what firm in what country manages to produce that particular commodity with the lowest total labor unit cost, that in turn consists of total labor times and real wages that synthesizes the conditions of production in terms of technology, the length and intensity of the working day, and real wages. And with respect to price determination, the theory proposes that the free mobility of capital will generate a tendency towards the formation of international prices of production that will equalize the profit rates for international regulating capitals. So in this sense, prices and hence the terms of trade will be determined by countries' real production cost, by total real unit labor cost. And this can be very easily extended to global value chains because each national link in the chain is subject to these forces of real cost and to these forces of real competition. So we can arrive to an answer to these questions, to these same 2 questions, to the question of specialization. Where does each link of the chain go? It will go wherever it's cheaper to produce, wherever there are the lower labor unit costs for the production of such commodity or semi-finished commodity. And the prices there will be a process for the tendency for the formation of international prices of production that will rapidly and turbulently equalize the profit rates for the regulating capitals in each link of the chain. So going back to the illustration, we would expect each production stage to concentrate where its cost of production are lower, and we would expect the prices of the commodity produced at each stage of the value chain to turbulently equalize the rate of profit for the regulating capitals in each stage. Now, this has several implications, I think, for the theory of uneven development. First, as a side note, there is space for low profitability activities because non-regulating capitals can be located anywhere in the world. And as was said before, the differences in profitability shouldn't be taken as evidence of monopoly power. Secondly, these international prices of production are neither fair nor efficient in the mainstream sense of the term, and neither is the specialization pattern, because there is a basic uneven development mechanism working, which is that in capitalist competition, the strong defeat the weak, and there are no automatic mechanisms correcting for such imbalances. So that free trade, even in the last era of capitalist globalization, will result in accelerated growth in development in some countries and regions, and unemployment and stagnations in others. Even as in the case of Mexico, you get this superficial view that the country is diversifying its production structure and becoming an export powerhouse. This is consistent with the evidence that globalization and trade liberalization have fueled rather than eliminated the tendency towards unevenness in development. And finally, the theory allows to explore the connection between the position of a country in global value chains and its relationship to trade balances and other macroeconomic variables. So finally, I think this opens several avenues for further research. I think one of the most important is that it provides a solid theoretical foundation to research empirically actual existence of monopoly, because if you are familiar with the literature, it is strongly based on the idea that the leading firms in global value chains operate as monopolies who extract rents to the firms that work as suppliers in developing countries. This theory provides the correct criterion to empirically go and research these kind of questions. And other questions such as what is happening to the terms of trade, and what are the determinants of the movements of the terms of trade, how do prices respond to labor productivity increases or cost reductions in the south and in the north, among several others. For all these reasons and for many others, I think that the theory of real competition on a global scale represents a major contribution to economic theory, and it promises to illuminate several aspects about the process of economic development and underdevelopment. Thank you.
Put the screen and then no, go down. No, you go down. Oh, that's. Hello, can you hear me at the back?
Yes.
Oh, great. So, thank you to the organizers for inviting me to participate. Of course, I know Anwar Shaikh, but I ran into Davide Gualerzi, whom I met yesterday in the urinal. All the major conversations that I have had in my long career typically have taken place in urinal. And I observed to Davide, I said, that was a nice session. It went like clockwork, thanks to Clara's firm hand. And he said, yes, but it was about reality. And you have disengaged from reality. So it is both true and not true. As I tried to explain to somebody, a graduate student at Hopkins who couldn't understand the proof, and said, how do you make this realistic, this proof? I said, it's a different register, it's not about reality. Then I explained the proof again. No, she said, it's very realistic. Now I understand it completely. So the reality, normally when someone talks of reality, I still check my wallets. Your reality, my reality, whose reality? But let me not just continue. I have prepared slides, so it will be a disciplined talk. But allow me 5 minutes of general chatting. So
Very Pakistani, by the way, maybe point out.
Pardon me?
With very Pakistani this digression.
Oh, there you go. So when I say I know Anwar Shaikh, I know him not only as a contemporary but as a compatriot. So he was, he and I we finished in 1973. We were intellectually born in the same year. In 1974, our published papers were in 1974. That published paper has been referred to on more than one occasion. For me, I got to know Anwar Shaikh as the David who slew Goliath. And I've been trying to catch up with that for a long time. So I'm still in 1974. Okay. So in some sense, of course, I don't know Anwar Shaikh as you guys know Anwar Shaikh. You have been a student, you have been part, you know him as a theorist of capitalism. So in preparing for this kind invitation, I went to your famous INET lecture. I also have been an INET lecture which I follow how many hits. We are increasing by 5 to 7 people. And I see you have 500,000 hits. You are out. So I said, this is the lecture I should hear. So like in the morning after Fajr prayers, this is also all Pakistanis, they are not, they observe. So after Fajr prayers, I've been listening to this INET interview. And there are lots of wonderful, wonderful things in that interview. And I made notes, finally, on the third listening. Third is very important. So, correcting the observation but false in the foundation. That's one of his sentences. And the 4 grades, there will be blood. And that caught me by surprise, because I've been studying that movie also. After a certain age, you can study whatever you want. Then something about Nazi Germany and so on. Then about socially and culturally embedded. So from the INET interview, I went to those masterful UMass lectures. Isabella spoke, others spoke. There he talks of how he was born as a Muslim, but he's atheist, of course. He specifies. And non-white Pakistani, I've been talking about my being characterized as a brown yesterday, so that's again in the right register. The emphasis on not to decry but to explain. This works. Tribal connections, nationality, regionality, invoking the tribal, the Nash program, and now this beautiful thing which he put in the UMass slides. The bark of human reason insecurely floats on the sea of human folly. This is Bertrand Russell's quote. I may have messed it up, but let's just continue. So it's a Darwin or the church. The Darwin or the church. And correct answer from the theory. So I went on. I have detailed notes. I can just go on for 15 minutes with those notes. But let me stop it. This is again Pakistani. Just bakwas. So, Bill Ghani's term, bakwas. So, point is, your heroes are my heroes. My heroes are not yours. But I have notes. I have a yellow pad where he told me, what are you working on? I said, RSS model. And he said, RSS? I said, no. Robinson Solo Srinivasan. Oh, then we talked. I don't know if you remember. He sent me a page of scribbled things. I was doing the primal side of the model. He did the pricing side of the model. Then of course, over the years, we've been talking of Goodwin and other things and so on. Mascolel, church and imperfection, Edenomics, the snake, market worship, strange attractors. Invisible hand is not balance but imbalance. Overshooting or undershooting. Order is in and through disorder. Master's phrases I have repeated. Want to do cellular level. And then chicken run. Attack of the killer tomatoes. I'm sorry, the first session was a serious session. So when I say I want to understand who's Anwar Shaikh, don't take it ill, Anwar. I am also now working on an article, Who's David Gale? And I'm looking at David Gale from different points of view. He too has been ignored in the mainstream of neoclassical economics. Every non-mainstream has its own mainstream. So let me then get to the presentation. So there is Anwar Shaikh with his magnum opus, has been described as the one who shaped the new school, the modern Sarafa. The dispassionate expositor. He said, I am a scientist, not biblical discourse. For me, science comes with great difficulty. So you need certain dispassionateness. So this is the outline of the talk that was. The preliminary remarks have been done. The INET interview has been done. Oh, theodicy. So we've had this exchange. Let me look. How many more minutes? 5 minutes more than formal presentation. So we've been having this exchange, and I loved your remark. You said, which remark? I made so many remarks.
Yes.
The remark that I am tired of labels. Let's get away from labeling. It is very much in the spirit of Bentham, in that utilitarianism demands labeling. If you want to sell something, you need a label. But we got hung up. I have a Pakistani student talking of Pakistani. She knows a lot of labels. She understands little but labels a lot. So she sent me something about brown man who valorizes neoclassical economics and so on. And like I said yesterday, I don't particularly think of myself as a brown man. But if that's the way she wants to talk to me, that's fine. She has a right. Only if you are, I don't want to get anything politically incorrect, but only if you belong to the excluded community, then you can make jokes about the excluded community. So she can make jokes about Pakistan. Oh yes, I'm sorry. That's a very geometrical thing. Yeah, it has to be perpendicular to the mouth. So where was I? Anwar got a copy of that email. And he said, like I said yesterday, he said, I have great respect for your work. And at once in the early morning after Fajr prayers, he said, oh, respect for your work. He said, but neoclassicism, you have been bullying this, he didn't say it, you have been bullying these students. There is neoclassicism. There is something. And today you heard many times, he did use the word neoclassicism. It's an important word for him, neoclassical theory. And I don't think of myself as a neoclassical. So I've been trying, if there's any merit in this talk, it is to deconstruct or explore what he means by neoclassical. And that's the only positive or if you say substantive contribution of these 15 minutes. And that is the Hegel-Shaikh program. So what the hell is the Hegel-Shaikh program? Hegel has not been mentioned. And so finally I understood what he means by neoclassical. He keeps saying, you see, he keeps saying, today he said it again, today, he said, neoclassical theory, you start from neoclassical theory and explain the world. He would rather start from the world and then theorize. And he's talked of take the phrases and make them religious. And more things. He said, I don't want to give biblical statements of everything that is true. And then he talked of Jim Clifton. So he has a vision of the capitalist system. He, as a theorist of the capitalist system, has a vision. And that which is not part of that vision, he calls neoclassical. I agree. That's neoclassical. You can approach neoclassical another way. Also, in that sense, I am not a neoclassicist. But for him, neoclassical also is building from the ground up, bringing from the perfect and then talking about the imperfect. That is what he objects to. So he objects to the word externalities and distortions, because you cannot understand what externality is if you don't understand what the de Broglie theorem is. You don't understand second best and distortions if you don't understand the basics of welfare economics. It's always proceeding from the Eden to the sinful. 1 minute. So I better show you the Hegel for the Hegel-Nash program. So, this Corsi on choice, you might read it quickly. I've been showing this in my Marshak lectures. This is from The Old Woman and the Cats. You have a cat, Anwar? No.
Not anymore.
Not anymore. This is Spasinetti as reported in Villa Pilar. And this came in an email yesterday. And I was still probing what he means by neoclassicism. So I stood on Vela's shoulders. Let's not read this. It's too technical. This is my punchline. A living relationship exists only in an articulated whole, whose parts themselves form for it. French abstractions, atomistic principles of that sort, in science as in politics. So this is the problem of the Nash program. You have to explain macroeconomic realities and give them micro foundation. You have to explain I can't say anything more. Macro with the micro. Let's see if I have another slide. Yes, I have another slide. But this is too philosophical. And this is the neoclassical. This is the neoclassical. So the terms caprice, individuality, idiosyncrasy, particularity. So I changed the slides and I put there, in the new slides, I have sociopathic. And I remember Anwar, after a Chinese meal, forced me to go to the bookshop down and buy that book on economist as a sociopath. And so that's what I wanted to put here. If I didn't have so many things to do, I would have put a footnote to that book which I don't know whether you paid for it or I paid for it. And now what happens? This I showed already. These are important references for. These are Anwar's heroes. And these are my heroes to some extent. But I am neither here nor there, so. And that's it, guys. Thank you.
Clara, can he have 1 minute to tell us about the films?
Perhaps during the discussion
Okay.
period, we'll return to it. I'm looking forward to chicken rice.
I want killer tomatoes.
Okay.
If I may say, what I like about chicken ramen is that the chickens organized themselves and created a kind of workers' revolution, and they overcome the
No, I don't.
They're, without a doubt, the worst microphones I've ever seen.
You have to come to UMass to get really bad microphones.
You have to literally be within 2 inches, 1 inch from the mic. No, this is-
COVID designed it.
You tell me if you cannot
No,
hear
we
me.
can hear you.
It's an enormous pleasure and honor to celebrate Anwar and his career. Rama already hinted at this, but we were pups when we came across. I came across Anwar's work when I was an undergraduate at Northwestern, trying to understand and learn Marxism. There was nobody at Northwestern to teach it, so I did, tried to do it myself. And his work was like an explosion. The rigor, the logic of it, but also, this hasn't been said, Anwar's extraordinary ability to write clearly in a way that he doesn't describe graphs, which is what 99% of economists do. He explains the intuitions, the causal logic behind them, which is a skill that's based, I should say it's dead now in the profession. It just doesn't happen. So for someone who was young, it was quite extraordinary. And like Rama, I had been brought up in a culture of Lenin and Luxembourg and Mao, and imbibed a certain understanding of how capitalism works, which is through the monopoly capital school. When I took those lectures to India, which she's talking about, it was very funny. We had friends who were coming out of the Maoist movement and very wedded to a certain orthodox. And Maoists, you don't get any more orthodox than Maoists. So I handed them these lectures, and C.D. Subbarao, who was the person who was a friend of ours, he took them and he went to Hyderabad for 2 weeks. This is where all of his comrades were, who were very theoretically engaged. He comes back after 2 weeks, and I don't know if you were there, Rahman, but he said to me, I said, "What do you think?" He said, "Who is this man?" I said, "Anwar Shaikh, Pakistan." He said, "Okay. Well, first of all, you created a real problem for us. I have to rethink everything now. And secondly, he said, there's no way he's South Asian. No South Asian could think this clearly, this logically. He said he has to be Egyptian." No, he's Pakistani. So, okay, so at least he's not Indian. So, yeah. Anyway, it's been a very long time that I came across the work, and then when I got a job at NYU, I sought him out, and we've been friends ever since, and it's been a great privilege and honor for me to have known him this long, and to continue to learn from him. What I wanted to do today was to make some remarks about the implications of his work for our understanding of empire and imperialism. My own abiding interest in Marxism came out of a desire to explain imperialism. And I don't know if I'm wrong about this, Anwar, correct me, but I remember either you told me or I read somewhere that that was actually your first ambition as well, was to gather up the economic theory through which you then understand how global capitalism and how empire works. And for Anwar, the first task was to build the foundations, an appropriate economic theory through which you could do that. And now it's been 50 odd years. where he did lay the foundations. Some of his earlier work addressed the issue of imperialism and components of it, like unequal exchange, like the Luxemburgian theories. But as an explicit focus, it kind of receded. And he spent most of his time developing the foundation for where we could actually move forward. And I must say, Jesus' paper was just fabulous. I'm really looking forward to reading it. Where is he? Jesus, am I getting it? Yeah. It was just, and that's exactly, I think, the kind of thing that one would like to see coming out of Sheikh's work. As you know, at the heart of Anwar's theoretical foundation that he built is what he calls real competition. And in many ways, you could just call it a classical theory of competition, a long period theory of competition. And he developed it against what, through the 70s, was the dominant paradigm in radical economics, which was the monopoly capital school, and under consumptionism. Now, one does not entail the other, but they were commonly found housed within the same theoretical packaging. And Anwar took both of them to be worthy of critique, because if they were true, then the law of value does not hold anymore. And if law of value doesn't hold anymore, there isn't very much that Marxian economics really has to say about how the world works. I took that to be his motivation, and he said it a couple of times in his article, and one could see what the implications were and why he was so motivated. Even though Baran and Sweezy presented their argument as an advancement and deepening of Marxist theory, in many ways what it did was it spelled the end of what we knew to be Marxist theory. Now, I entirely agree that words, labels, is not what you should be after, but the label is attached to a causal structure. And if that causal structure no longer holds, then you're going to have to need a new one. Why does this matter? Well, scientific progress, it matters, but it also matters because with these theories came particular implications for political strategy. And to my mind, that's the reason they matter. To my mind, the Leninist theory generated and the underconsumptionist theory generated quite backward implications for international labor movements, for working class movements, and for understanding the role of empire, not just with regard to the South, but its place in the core countries as well, like the theory of the labor aristocracy and things like that. So I think the implications are quite high, whatever labels you attach to these things. And I'd like to explore some of the implications of Anwar's work for these foundational issues and the geopolitical implications, and try to make a case in defense of it, that the work actually not only is able to explain the same phenomena that imperialism took up, but is able to do so in a way that has fewer dilemmas and fewer contradictions than that theory holds. Now, Lenin and Luxemburg are the two key figures, I think, that are in the background for what Anwar is doing in the early stages of his career. Of course, filtered through Baran and Sweezy, but of course, what Baran and Sweezy were doing was building on that foundation that these two laid. And there are a couple of central elements to both of those theories. For Lenin, as you know, he was quite emphatic that, and he actually gave it a year, a precise date. Lenin says, in 1900, the world changed from one of competition to one of monopoly. Now, he does not say, like Rama was trying to say, that there are instances of monopoly or there's a strong tendency towards monopoly. He said monopoly extinguishes competition. He's quite clear about that. And through that, he now explains that the governing the most important events of his time, which is the derailing of the labor movements, the splitting of it within Europe, and then the rise of imperialism as a specific stage of capitalism, and that stage of capitalism geopolitically is bound up with a stage of capitalism economically, which is monopoly. Now, from that, he generates a series of strategic implications, not just for working classes in the North, but also for anti-colonial movements in the South. Luxemburg has a related but distinct theory, which is one which insists that capitalism suffers from a chronic problem of inadequate demand, for which it has to seek out new zones, not outside the countries, but outside the economic zones of capitalism. Right? So wherever the capitalism is, it might be in Namibia, it might be in Europe, but it has to seek out non-capitalist zones in order to incorporate them into the system in such a way that they can provide a new, fresh market for the goods that it cannot consume domestically, which inevitably means you have an outward thrust. And that inevitably means that outward thrust is going to take a militaristic form because these subsequent countries may not welcome outside intruders to govern their affairs. And she has a clear prediction, is that as these countries take over the global south, they will, but she said, destroy the natural economy. They will bring those economies into the vortex of commodity circulation through commodifying them, through creating wage labor and creating dependence on the market, and hence the necessity to consume the goods that are coming out of the capitalist zones. Very powerful theories, economically quite compelling, empirically validated. They did really try to look out into the world and see whether what their theory is saying is true or not. And incredibly important motivations, quote, implications for political strategy as well. Now, if these theories are problematic, presents us with a dual challenge. One is to generate an alternative theory of the same economic phenomena that they think their theories adequately explain. And Anwar has been very clear about this throughout his work. If you want to have an alternative theory, it needs to be able to explain those same phenomena that these theories take as confirmations for their own work. Secondly, and this is where it's up to the rest of us, you have to explain those geopolitical phenomena, the same phenomena. World War I, the rise of empire in the 19th century, the Cold War, the emergence of the global south, all these things, you have to be able to explain it through an alternative theory of capitalist dynamics. So Anwar takes up the first of these two challenges in his work, which is laying the foundation of an alternative economic theory, which explains the same economic phenomena that these theories took up for themselves. And at the core of it is this theory of real competition. And Anwar looks at the evidence for monopolies, and he says this evidence is actually quite consistent with the theory of turbulent competition. Now, what's at the essence of that theory of turbulent competition? It is not a denial that monopolies arise. This is where I would, my take is somewhat, I think, different than Rama's. I'm trying to find a polite way of saying it, Rama's. Of course, monopolies arise. And all the phenomena that Rama talked about are quite similar to what Hilferding and what Lenin and Luxemburg talked about. The rise of finance is controlling place, these networks that bind the firms together, the ability to put temporary barriers to entry for other capital, the artificial or legal barriers that are put up, all that stuff is true. I don't think anything in Anwar's work denies that. The question is not whether they arise, but whether they can be sustained over time. And the evidence that he provides, and that others like Billy Sembler and John Weeks provided, was that they have not been able to sustain them over time. Which means then something very interesting, which is that you do have the tendency towards extra profits, surplus profits, super profits. The issue is whether they can become permanent features of the system, or whether they are passing features of the system, or internal to the system. Now, similarly with Luxembourg, Anwar's point with Luxembourg is quite profound, which is it's not that capitalism doesn't require expansion of markets. It's that it does not require a geographical expansion to acquire new markets, because what it does is it creates new markets within the zones where it's dominant by a deepening of that market. Now, for that, he needed a theory of effective demand, and he spent a long time generating that. But the core point here was that what is new about the system of capitalism is that it's the first mode of production in global history that generates its own demand domestically. What Luxembourg, I would put it this way, Luxembourg actually substituted a theory of feudal growth for a theory of capitalist growth. Feudalism does require geographical expansion. Capitalism benefits from it, but it is not functionally necessary for capitalism to acquire it. Now, these two elements of Anwar's theory generate a very important series of predictions for the economic dynamics of the system. One is that capital is going to be mobile. It's very, very, very difficult to restrict for the long term the mobility of capital in its ceaseless quest for extra profits. That this mobility of capital breaks down what Marx called the Chinese walls of super profits and extra profits. That those, then as Rama said, There's an tendency towards an equalization among the regulating profits, to be sure, but the tendency to equalize regulating profits coexists with a dispersion of rates of profit across capitals in the same sector. Now, what that means then, very summary form, is that in this process there's no tendency toward equalization per se, equilibration the way neoclassicals think of it. What you have is the coexistence of equalization across one band of capitals and disequilibration towards another, which gives you a theory not of placid equilibrium, but of uneven development. To re-emphasize what Jesus said. Now, uneven development generates a series of interesting implications. The first of all, there will be enormous dispersion of profit margins and profit rates at any given moment when you take a snapshot, and for short periods. Secondly, there will be rents. What Ahmed was talking about. There are going to be moments where capitals rely simply on extracting rents. I mean rent in the neoclassical term. And thirdly, there's going to be the use of power. Sometimes, as in Jayati, what she showed, sometimes it's economic power, where you can extract above market interest, what looks to be above market interest rates for yourself. Sometimes it'll be political power, because successful capitalists exercise political influence. All of that is consistent with a theory of uneven development. The question is this: are any of these phenomena going to be typical of how profits are extracted, or are these exercises of power and rents and etc. deviations from what is modal? If it is a deviation from what is modal, then it's consistent with the theory of general competition or real competition. The question is, can it become typical? And now the challenge is for both people, for proponents of real competition and for people who are skeptical, to come up with what the range of evidence would be which would allow you to say that this is either typical or not typical. Anwar's theory runs the danger of becoming a tautology, because anytime you present it with counteracting evidence, he'll say, well, you just need to wait longer. Well, you need to come up with a sense of how long you have to wait. But for the critics, they have to understand that anytime they see a deviation from equal profits or equal power or something, it's not a disconfirmation of his theory, because the theory predicts the same things. So that theory of uneven development now can become the foundation of a theory of capitalist geopolitics as well. Can it be done? In the 30 seconds I have, the answer is yes. I believe we can do this. You can have an alternative theory of imperialism in the 19th century, of the start of World War I, of the onset of the Cold War, of the rise of World War II, of the Cold War after that, and the defeat of the Soviets, all based on a reading of history that's consistent with the theory of uneven development. Not combined and uneven, that's a whole other thing, and it's not a theory. Combined and uneven development is not a theory. But a theory of uneven development can, I think, provide the foundation for a theory of imperialism, imperialist geopolitics, that are more, I think, consistent with historical events than Lenin and Luxemburg theories were. And we have Anwar to thank for doing the extraordinarily hard work of setting the foundations for that. Thank you.
So I'm going to invite our panelists, please, to join to that up the front, and Anwar as well. Thanks to all three of you for exemplary timekeeping. Once again, we've got about 30 minutes for questions and discussion. And Jayati, I note your killer tomatoes questions.
Yes.
Forgotten. But I think, first of all, Anwar, let's give you the floor. Where is that second mic?
I don't know if one or like only on the back, maybe they work better.
No, I think he was in the right position. That's really what matters. You have to keep the right position.
Doesn't matter if we go from been very close with us last time. It's mostly people online that
Can you hear me now?
Can you lift it a bit?
Nick, you should tell us if it's good for the online.
Just talking to the microphone and you'll be good.
I'm so grateful for all the comments and,
Is that on?
you know,
You
Then
seem to be
we-
very close.
Yeah, get closer, yeah.
I'm so grateful for all the comments and questions and the pointing out of the further work that needs to be done. That has always been my goal. I don't claim to have answers for many things, but I do believe that you can get questions. There's more than one way to interpret that, and you have to go back to the real. It cannot be done in your head. I mean, I spent probably 5 or 7 years trying to understand interest rates and financial things and link it to show how you can explain these things from the same foundation, but you have to be more concrete. They're not abstract. You have to see what capital does. I mentioned it before, but I really like to read Harvard Business Review. Because they're not embarrassed to tell you what they do. They say, well, we did this or that, with some capitals came in and crushed the others. One example was, I can't remember the new soda that was coming out. And the point was to show that the old one, old Coke or whatever, was now obsolete. So the guy put all the old stuff in some open place and drove a tractor over it. Now, that's what I call real competition. That's what it's about. Sure, I'm gonna crush you. And, I see it all the time. On Jesus thing, let me just mention that Isabella and I wrote a very long, detailed paper for the Chinese press about how our argument explains the concrete phenomena of Chinese development, as well as has an answer to all the explanations coming from the conventional literature, which Chinese mostly adopt in economics of China, very much closely tied to orthodox economics in the West. And I think it was a really good paper, and they, after 2 rounds of saying you need more, they rejected it, because they didn't like the conclusion. And the conclusion was that there's another way of explaining Chinese development, which is actually internal to it, and they didn't like that because it contradicted, I hate to say this word, neoclassical theory. So for me, it's really important, and Jesus was bringing it out, to understand that you don't know most things. You really have to understand that you're trying to find a way, but you have to have a place to stand. Now, if it can't work, then you have to say it doesn't work. And my experience is if you try hard enough and you read the business literature, you begin to see why they do it. And that gives you a clue as to dynamics, because they're not embarrassed to tell you at all. And they're proud of it, actually. So, and the question of each link in the global value chain, I always think of it differently. Suppose that you look at different states in a country. There'll be a link in a value chain within the country, right? So if you look at the value added there, it'll be different. Now, if some of them split away, it'll be a national difference, but the difference doesn't arise from nationality, it arises from the concrete conditions of the production process. And if you think of it that way, then you can say, what does nationality, the exchange rate, add to this? And then you need a theory of the exchange rate. And you come back to the same point, what does competition have to say about that? Can you establish that it is competitive? There was a point made about efficiency. You know, and this is one of my pet peeves. The term efficiency in engineering means the relation of useful output to input, useful energy output. It does not mean output to input, because then it would be one. So what is useful? What's the definition of useful? In economics, it's supposedly utility and benefit and all that. In business, it's profit. It's efficient if it makes profit. And it doesn't matter if it screws the nation, screws the environment, screws people. It's efficient. And then you have to say, well, we don't want you to be efficient in order to be nice. And Hayek says, no. If you start doing that, you ruin capitalism. You ruin capitalism because capitalism is efficient in its own sense. And I think that's a very important point for me. Ali, I don't know what to say to him. He's brilliant and he's funny and he gets to the key points. So let me speak instead about another movie, which is Monty Python and the Holy Grail. I love it. I used to show it in classes, but then they wouldn't fund it. They wouldn't fund it. So in Monty Python and the Holy Grail, King Arthur and his band are wandering through England and make many adventures. They run across a workers' collective or peasant collective who attacks them and says, "Who the hell are you? Who made you king?" But at one point they come to a bridge, and to cross that bridge, there's an evil gnome, and that gnome asks you a question, and if you can answer it, you pass, and you can't, you die, you fall off the bridge. So, Lancelot comes up, and the gnome says, "What's your name?" And he says, "Lancelot." He goes, "Okay." The next guy asks him something, and he doesn't know, he falls. And so back and forth, the gnome can choose the question. It comes to King Arthur, and he says, "What's the wingspan of a swallow?" And King Arthur says, "Do you mean the English or the European swallow?" And the gnome says, "I don't know," and he falls into it. And then King Arthur says, "Kings need to know stuff like this." That's the importance of concrete knowledge. Concrete knowledge.
I have to say, I never thought of it that way.
On Vivek, I thank Vivek for his generous words. His reach is far beyond mine. He can talk about the development of capitalism, he talk about uneven exchange, uneven development of the world, about the debates in India and about development, rents, power, and says it better than I could. And by the way, he writes beautifully. His book's a big success. Though it pisses off a lot of people, but that's part of success. We often have conversations. We don't necessarily agree on competition, but we have wonderful conversations. And I'm always confident with him that the questions raised will be difficult questions. And in the sense that's what you want. You want something that pushes you beyond. And lastly, I've tried all my life to say that there are different consistent foundations. And I've only mentioned classical because you can call it whatever you want, utility theory or perfect, not perfect framework of competition. But there are, that's what I was going to say. The reason I care about that is that there are also other schools of thought. Post-Keynesian economics, very well represented in our department, very concretely developed, very sophisticated. And I want to say that that is an important strand in our heterodox thinking. And I also want to distinguish what I'm saying from that. So I have talked about Sweezy and monopoly and all that, because those are the roots. Koletsky, for instance. I have great regard for these arguments. Lavoie and Mark and others are friends of mine for a long, long time. But I want to make the difference in a respectful way. I'm not trying to do a polemic. I'm trying to show that different approaches have different implications and that we have to address those implications. And disagreement there is perfectly fine. I think that's all I have to say here. I will develop some of these ideas and when I'm being interviewed. But one last thing, against the movie. You know how education not just gives you knowledge, but it takes away knowledge, right? That's an important thing to understand. You come in, you know what the world is like, and by the time you leave graduate school, you have no clue what the world is like in most graduate schools. And for me, that is the equivalent of Men in Black, the movie. Remember, they have this little device, so you see the world, you see that it's full of aliens and creatures, and then they go, "Look at this." You forget that that's microeconomics.
So he's done.
And always say who you are if you like, so that.
Hi, Nathan Tankis. I wanted to comment on Jesus' presentation, but kind of connected to Matt from the last panel and Rama's comments from the last panel, and this sort of like question about international, the kind of basic point here, real competition, truly non-neoclassical ideas about competition, things that believe Fred Lee. They're theories of firms. They're theories of firm competition, not theories of country competition. At least fundamentally, you can have implications and stuff. And so the thing about your presentation that I want to put a pick on, which I thought was very good, but that you didn't talk about, is you have a comment about the regulating capital, that price being the reigning price in the international market, and thus determining the price for, say, an industry in Mexico selling to another country. You know, an obvious problem there is that implies an arm's length transaction, but significant percentage of global trade, I don't know the last statistics, but 30, 40 more percent, is literally just within the firm, just within from one affiliate to a parent, affiliate to affiliate.
65%.
55%.
65%.
65%, even more. I mean, I wanted to not overly exaggerate because I couldn't remember the figure offhand, but I knew it was some huge number like that. So when that's true, these rules about transfer prices are just rules about international corporate trading. They're not some competition competitive rule. They're just like rules about that to try to organize, international corporate taxation and avoid, tax competition or tax avoidance, evasion, whatever. So in that context, you have a circumstance where profit upon alienation, vertical control, you have sort of a vertical control, and it's just literally the same company ownership, where unequal development, unequal exchange, quote unquote, between countries is perfectly consistent with any theory of firm competition, because firms are competing. The multinational company is competing with other companies, largely other multinational companies. And so kind of, that big asterisk to the regulating capital determining export prices, I think, is a huge part of all these kind of issues, and is definitely something that can bring consistency in all of this.
Yeah, thanks. Just to add quickly to that, I think one way possibly, Jesus, is to actually look at the intangibles in the trade. And the TIVA database would allow you to do some of that, at least by country. But by company, also I imagine that there will be some role of intangibles that you could isolate, which would capture some of what Nathan is saying. But I actually had a question to Ali. I mean, I want to know about the other movies, particularly Killer Tomatoes.
Another movie? I've got one. Terminator. It's a great movie.
I haven't actually seen a single one of these, so I'm out of it.
You should start with There'll Be Blood.
Yeah, I mean, my life has been wasted,
There'll
obviously.
Be Blood.
I was 32 when I saw my first James Bond film.
Oh.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Really,
I have a kind of question for you that follow up on what said. I think foundationally speaking, the productivity differences of individual firms start with the innovation economy, where some
Ahmed, like this.
become exporters, so to speak. So in that sense, those exporters in some settings, some countries, benefit from tax breaks. Tax is considered by the exporters as part of the cost. So if you have tax incentive, tax break as an exporter, then obviously your price, exported goods price, is going to be lower, which adds a kind of competitive edge because of the institutional setting, because of specific economic policy. So therefore, maybe at a later, much concretized stage of your calculation of value transfer, I think you should also consider this tax incentive and how it affects competitive cost worldwide. That's one comment or question. The other one is that I've been hearing labels, okay, and usually, okay, let me put it differently. I'm going to raise two questions. One is that why does one adopt a label, and what exactly that person does with it? I think it's worth thinking about it. I assume some of us use labels, not exchanging labels or attacking other labels, for other purposes as well. And relatedly, why does one abandon labels? And I'm sure many of us know, in many instances, labels abandoned for personal fame and personal gain. And these things, unfortunately, not pronounced in academic, polite, setting, but I just want to draw your attention to it. And in terms of, Vivek presentation, that I'm just looking at the economic aspect of imperialism. I see two ways of extracting value from, let's say, using old jargon, third world region by advanced capitalist countries. One prominent one, obviously, unequal exchange, which assumes that there is some sort of profit equalization worldwide. I'm skeptical about that. I think Jayeto also raised a question on that. The second one is, which is becoming popular to the monthly review, the so-called super exploitation of third world workers. And I see actually less evidence on that. So I wonder what to think about unequal exchange versus super exploitation.
I'm not sure I know that literature, so.
How many more questions are there on the floor? One, so maybe you can take that question and give it back to you. Yes?
Thank you. I'm Jens Briapiotis. I'm a PhD, first year PhD student at the New School. It was a great panel for different reasons, but it was great. So just one question to Professor Ziebek. In terms of the questions of uneven development and imperialism, apparently what we see is that we start a discussion on uneven development or the questions of imperialism as having the classicals of imperialism as a point of departure, and they critique productive or not towards them. But the question is, have we actually depleted what Marx and Engels have to say about uneven development first, without going to the second sources? In my research, perhaps it's very early on, but going back to the sources, the classical sources, as Anwar would say, apparently there can be a framework that can be deducted out of that. And in that framework, you can situate the work of Anwar and the framework of real economic analysis in a completely different way that doesn't take as a point of departure the existing kind of debate, but kind of approaches the question at hand from a completely different vantage point, in terms of bypassing, of course taking the important stuff, but bypassing the very classicals of imperialism. There's something about Marx and Engels, the classical edition, that perhaps is useful in that. But there's just one way of approaching the question and actually talking about how real economic analysis can be part of it. I mean, if you stay for the presentation, I will draw some lines later on. That was an invitation. But it was great. And Professor Khan, it's always a bliss to see you lecturing, and we always enjoy it. Sorry, Professor Khan, I have to acknowledge that for Professor Khan.
He's Greek. They don't pronounce K. I would like to answer.
Yes.
So only one answer. Of course labels are important. Of course we need to find out why they are adopted, what they indicate, and why they are given up. Of course, for sure. So here the way you talk is a very fine sentence. You can substitute model for label. Sarah Berry asked me why are models adopted and then why are models jettisoned. But labels must also be disaggregated. Of course, we learn from Harsani there are types, right? So there are these types. They tell you, I am an Asian, that's a label. It explains something of which I am not, but it needs to be disaggregated. And so this disaggregation is very important. Of course, neoclassical label tells you something. It needs disaggregation. How disaggregation? Is it in the register of calculus? Is it in the register of smoothness? Is it in the register of maximization? Is it in the register of maximization with complete and transitive preferences or with non-ordered behavioral preferences? Labels need to be aggregated because we are in the business also, not only of practice but of scholarship. That's all.
Yeah, thank you so much for the comments. I think they are great. And yeah, both make reference to the fact that the argument that I presented is still very general, and it requires a higher level of concreteness. And yeah, like this point about multinational corporations, I think is very relevant. I would say that the question about specialization is still there, like where will multinational corporations decide where to outsource the particular production processes? Well, they will do it trying to minimize their cost of production. But it is true, we don't know what happens to the profits of these affiliate in a developing country. So we definitely need to find better ways of measuring what is the actual profitability of these affiliates that it's not probably not correctly reflected in their books, right? Because of the transfer pricing and all of that. And that has to do with the profitability of the big multinational corporation considered as a whole and not just of the different affiliates and the headquarters, right? Yes, I think it's very relevant. To the question about tax rates, yeah, I think it's very relevant. In the case of Mexico, its export development started like that with special economic zones, these plans that are called maquiladora set in the northern border precisely to size upon these special policies of tax breaks, of the reduction of tariffs, and hence, like I thought of it as like a state-created absolute advantage in assembly activities through these particular policies. Yeah, so, and yeah, looking at the intangibles as a way of knowing what's the extent of outsourcing, I think it's a very, yeah, very...
No, also for tax breaks.
Yeah, and for
It's
that.
mostly for tax breaks.
Okay, yeah. Yeah. Thank you for the comments.
Responding to Ahmed's remarks about imperialism, I had wanted to say something about unequal exchange in regard to Anwar's work, because this is one of the issues that he took up early on in his writings and then set aside. And I've lately been begging him to come back to this, and he keeps telling me he's got more important things to do, which is wrong, because this is really important. That one of the most important things that Anwar said about unequal exchange has kind of been lost in the literature, which is that unequal exchange is not something that happens between rich and poor countries. It's internal to capitalism in that it comes about between regulating and non-regulating capital through the equalization of the profit rate. So what that means is every time you're selling at the social value of the price of production, there's an unequal exchange going on in that more efficient capitals are taking out more value than they produce from the inefficient capitals. Now, when you take this to the North-South relations, the point he made this is if you want to see the fruits of unequal exchange for the North, now you have to net it out between the equalization of the profits rate across countries and also within a country. And there's no way to prejudge it. It's an empirical question. You're closer to prejudging it if you can confidently say that all the inefficient capitals are geographically located in the South. But he's pointed out in the 70s that it's much more true now. You can't take that for granted. With the spread of capitals across the world that comes about with uneven development, there is plenty of value transfer going on in both directions. And the recent resurgence of unequal exchange literature simply ignores this. It takes countries to be proxies for capitals. So there, to my mind, we have to come back to that, the empirics of that, through the framework that he laid out, and I'm not sure what you're going to find. For super exploitation, let's just be clear what these things mean. I take super exploitation to mean paying workers a wage that's below the value of their labor power. Whereas in a lot of the monthly review literature, it just means treating workers really badly. So if we mean paying workers below the value of their labor power, that need not be a source of enrichment for the West, because it all depends on how productive the capitals are that are paying them those wages. If it turns out that those capitals are not very productive, what you're getting is the extraction of, in Marxian terms, absolute surplus value, which in actual proportion of total surplus value that's in the West may not be very much at all. Super exploitation is to be regretted and be condemned. I don't know where it can be placed as a source of the enrichment or the perpetuation of the enrichment of the North. But the question about the uneven development, I really agree with it. I think there's no need to constantly go through this critique of Lenin and Luxemburg. That would, important at a certain stage because it was hegemonic.
Right.
And you had to deal with it, and you had to, I think actually the way to move forward is to set that stuff aside. And that's what he's tried to do, is build a new foundation. If Marxism is not a theology, if it's actually a research program, actually you shouldn't keep going back to the classics. At some point you have to take the classics as an inspiration. But you have to say, is the theory consistent with the ambitions of the classics? But you don't constantly do a word check to see if you're agreeing with them. And I take that to be the spirit of what you're saying. I do believe they're massively underutilized. John Weeks, in some of his later works, was trying to build, I think, a different foundation, partly inspired by Anwar. Donald Harris took his last 15 years, was trying to build a theory of uneven development, both based on Schraffa and on neoclassical economics. I think that's the way to move forward. Unfortunately, there aren't a lot of economists interested in these issues these days.
Anwar, last words to you before we go to lunch.
I'll try to be quick. I think one comment, if I understood it correctly, was that the theory of real competition does not apply within firms. That firms have different needs.
No. That it's a theory of firms, not necessarily a theory of larger conception. It's firm focused, that firms are the
No, it's not in my intention, but I also heard that it didn't apply to the different aspects of a firm itself. And I want to argue against both of those. The whole point of the theory of real competition for me is that it does translate into a theory of nations. That's the point. And you can do that by being, as Vivek pointed out, talk about the location of the firms. If the efficient firms are in China, and the inefficient firms are in the US, then you got a really good explanation for the trade deficit. We can look at that. Isabel and I wrote a very concrete paper about just that issue. So I asked you to take a look at that. But this is an older issue which is really important. Marx emphasizes that what industrial capital did was to take over different modes of handicraft production and assemble them in one space so that, first of all, you remove the inefficiency of going from one place to another, the inefficiency of working different hours, put them in the discipline of capitalism. And part of that discipline is the mechanization of labor. You know, instead of one person doing 5 different things making pin, this is Adam Smith, you have one person making the head of a pin, one person pulling it out, and the point that Adam Smith makes is that enormously increases the productivity of the firm and lowers the cost. And that is, in Marx's idea, the beginning of the transformation, the real subsumption of labor, as he calls it, that really makes the foundation for the capitalist firm. Now, a central point there is that by reducing labor to a series of mechanical activities, you can replace it with a machine. If one person's job is to hit the top of a pin to get ahead, well, it's pretty clear that's a lever. And he traces how that happens. So that transformation is again due to the concern of capital for the detail steps, because the detail steps affect the costs, and costs are what determines whether they live or die. The book I recommend on this remarkable book is Harry Braverman's book called Labor and Monopoly Capital, which talks about the transformation of firms and the creation of large enterprises which are dominated and fixated on every step. You mentioned, for instance, that they realized that they put the toilets in the center of the hall. Workers would spend less time going to the toilet and therefore would have more time to work, so to speak, right? And this is a detail, but it makes a difference to their, and so that every stage of the process is subject to this discipline. Go to McDonald's. The original McDonald's was built on a kind of assembly line thing, but now it's totally assembled. It's just workers doing machine labor. It can easily be replaced by that. So I hate to bring this up, but there's another movie about that, which is Terminator. Terminator is about the point where we mechanize our activities to such a point that machines can do them better. And now it's there. And look in any newspaper, you can see the robots coming out, and they can do many things, including take care of people or kill people. Drones are robots. That is the mechanization process created by firms in order to improve their profitability. And that's intrinsic, natural, and cannot be stopped by at least ordinary means. So I urge you to look at these as a development process, a logic of capital, and consider then where it goes, where it's in. Last point, environmental. It's very clear that it's efficient for capital to destroy the environment, because then you have lower costs. Those costs are passed on. And so, well, that's an externality. What's an externality? An externality, the profit, is an internality for profit because it reduces it. So we have to not accept the terms of a different framework in which assumption is that everything is good for society, scarcity, and all of that requires this efficient allocation. That's absolute nonsense. Efficiency is efficiency of profit. And if you try to go against it, you'll find out very quickly how powerful that efficiency is. And I don't mean just the workers, for the capitalists themselves. You don't make profit, you're gone. They don't care about you. They care about, as they say, the dollar number. So we should respect more the pressure that capitalists, I can't say pity the poor capitalists, but in fact, their heads roll too if they don't make it.
Just say a very quick word before we break for lunch. I'll ask department members and presenters to just remain in place for a few minutes. Everybody else, please note we'll reconvene at 2:45 p.m. sharp to continue the discussion with the student session. I apologize for us not being able to provide lunch for all participants. That's because we're working on a new school budget. And I'll take this opportunity to remind you that all participants are invited to the reception, in fact expected at the reception immediately after the conference this evening. So bear that in mind as you choose your lunch, and we'll see you all at 2:45 p.m. sharp.
You haven't provided the menu for the reception.
To Nathan's point, there's two different ways. The reconfiguration of the effective productive competitive unit.